I never imagined the train ride home would feel more like a funeral march than the funeral itself. 10 years gone, and Savannah still breathes like a secret I wasn't supposed to remember. But grief has a sharp scent. It waits for you behind pews and sideways glances. If you've ever walked into a room where no one remembers who you were, only who they want to blame you for being. This is my family tale. The morning I arrived, the fog clung to the brick streets like Savannah was trying to hide its shame. My boots hit the ground, and the earth didn't welcome me back. It flinched. The city hadn't changed, but I had. I carried New York in my spine now, poems in my purse, and silence sharp as sea glass. At the church, the first voice I heard wasn't the priest's. It was Graham's. You came back just to see what he left you, huh? His voice had a razor's edge, honed by 10 years of built-up blame. I didn't answer. Some fights don't need fists, they need forgetting. Marcia, my stepmother, didn't speak either. Just looked at me like I was a smudge on her family portrait. My father's widow in pearls. Me in black with ink, stained hands. Once, my father had called my poems the useless musings of someone afraid to build something real. I was 13. I believed him. I slipped a copy of my latest chapbook, Wind Doesn't Ask Permission, onto the altar when no one was looking. By the time I came back from the restroom, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there, like I hadn't either. So I sat in the back row, alone, watching a life I wasn't invited to grieve. Graham stood at the pulpit with that same smug smile he used when he beat me at chess by cheating. My father built a legacy, he said, and I will carry it forward. As if the hammer passed to his hands didn't come with the bruises left on mine. I didn't cry. I never do in public, but my lips moved around the words of a poem I hadn't written yet. He thinks I'm weak. Because I didn't scream loud enough to make him listen. After the service, I didn't go to the reception. I walked alone to the old cemetery. The one he used to take me to when I was 7, to teach me about placement. Everything has its spot, Evelyn. I knelt beside his grave, brushing dirt from the stone. No flowers, no forgiveness, just me and the ache. I pulled a folded page from my coat. Handwritten, weathered from my fingers rereading it on the train. You once told me my words had no weight. But they carried me farther than your empire ever could. I wrote about you once. Can you read it now? I tucked the poem under the stone. Maybe someone would find it, maybe not. Maybe this was the only revenge I had left. Hidden revenge, not loud or cinematic, but quiet and intentional, a daughter's soft rebellion. A poet's last word. The thing about revenge stories, no one tells you how often they begin with love that was never returned the right way. As I stood to leave, the wind shifted, one of those strange Savannah breezes that feels like it's carrying a message not meant for you. But you hear it anyway. Have you ever loved someone who only saw the version of you they needed to stay comfortable? If yes, then maybe you've left your own letter with no name. Maybe you're still waiting for someone to read it. You think silence just happens, that it sneaks in when words dry up. But silence, the kind that stains, is engineered, like concrete laid down to cover the softest parts of memory. When I came home, I thought I was grieving a father. But what I was really grieving was every sentence he never got to read, every envelope that never made it to his hands. This isn't just a family tale. It's a betrayal story dressed as mourning. I asked Marcia one question. Did you ever read the letters I sent? She looked up from her tea as if I'd asked the weather to explain itself. Then silence. Not the kind that aches, the kind that was crafted, cut to size, like a dress sewn from someone else's shame. That night, I wandered the property like I used to as a child, chasing lightning bugs and hoping to be caught. In the garage, behind an old metal filing cabinet, I found a cardboard box sealed with brittle tape. My name was on every envelope. Handwriting from 5 years ago, postmarked from New York. Birthday cards, gallery invites, essays clipped from magazines. Even a copy of the poem that was published in the New Yorker. Not one opened. I don't remember dropping to my knees, just the sound of 1,000 hopes unraveling at once. The next morning, Graham found me at the kitchen counter, still holding one of the unopened envelopes. You really thought he cared about those cryptic little poems of yours? He laughed. A true infidelity story doesn't always begin in bedrooms. Sometimes, it starts in the mailbox, when the family you trust sleeps with silence instead of truth. Later, an old gardener, Mr. Alvarez, who still trims the hedges no one visits, tugged at my sleeve. Your father? I saw him hide your book, the one with the blue spine, put it in his desk like it was contraband. And then came Jude. Jude, with his crooked grin and paint, splattered shoes. We hadn't spoken in years, but he hugged me like time bends for grief. He came to one of your readings. Jude whispered. Sat in the back. Didn't sign the guest book. Didn't clap. Just sat there, Evelyn. And when you read that poem about the storm and the lighthouse, he cried. We went back to his apartment, sat on the floor like teenagers again. He pulled out an old notebook from under a stack of records. Look familiar? He asked, flipping it open. There, in my father's handwriting, was a line from one of my poems. No citation. No date. Just a single line written like a secret he didn't know how to love out loud. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up writing, through the ache, through the numbness. A poem titled The Shadow Never Named poured out of me like a confession I didn't know I'd been holding. Some fathers die with apologies still tied to their tongues. Jude said that to me as I finished reading it aloud. And I believed him. The next morning, I took the box of unread letters, the physical proof of a decade's worth of dismissed connection, and walked it to the magnolia tree behind the chapel. That tree had witnessed so much, a younger me with scraped knees, a stern man teaching me how to rake leaves in lines, and now, this. I buried it there, no ceremony, just dirt and tears. A funeral for the version of myself that waited for answers. Do you think silence can rot a memory the way rain does wood? Because I do. And sometimes, the only way to grieve what never grew is to plant it anyway. This isn't just an infidelity story between lovers. This is what betrayal looks like when it wears your last name. People think memory is a photograph, sharp, frozen, easy to frame. But memory is more like smoke from a house that's burned down thick, clinging, and impossible to trace to one exact fire. When I came looking for answers, I didn't find a father. I found pieces. And those pieces, they didn't fit. But I started collecting them anyway. Because sometimes, the most painful stories are the ones we inherit without knowing. I didn't go back to the office to lead. I went back to look. A man named Harold Dunn, one of my father's oldest business partners, showed up at the door, his hands weathered like an old map. I figured you'd want this, he said, passing me a thick folder. Inside, a sketch, a church, rendered in clean black lines with only one note in handwriting I knew like my own reflection, E.H. Will understand when the time comes. I stared at that single line so long my eyes blurred. Understand what? Forgiveness? Expectation. The way grief changes the shape of even the most solid things. Later that week, I met Mrs. Whittaker, our former housekeeper. I still remember the way your father would sit in his study, she said, twisting a ring on her finger. Pull out those old envelopes. Yours. He didn't say much. Just read them again, sometimes aloud. Mostly when he couldn't sleep. Grief sat heavy in my chest, like a song with no melody, just low, haunting notes that refused to leave. But Graham, of course, didn't see it that way. You digging through Dad's life so you can write more poems. He barked, storming into the hallway. Is that what you're doing now? Stories about cheating fathers and broken legacies. He was angry. But it didn't feel like rage. It felt like fear wearing its Sunday clothes. That night, I began to gather the fragments from Harold, from Mrs. Whittaker, from dusty files no one had opened since the funeral. A receptionist gave me a slip of yellowing paper. A custodian found this under the old HVAC system. We think it's yours. It was one of my poems. One I wrote when I was 16. Torn down the middle, but carefully pinned back together, like someone had broken it on purpose. Then couldn't bear to let it stay that way. I sat in the hallway with the poem in my lap, my knees folded beneath me like prayer. And I wrote again, The Father of Two Faces, a poem that stitched love with disillusionment, that admitted yes, I missed him, and yes, I resented him, and yes, I still wanted him to come back from the grave and say my name like it mattered. A local journalist reached out the next day. Everyone's talking about the unexpected hair of Heartland Realty, she said. Mind if I get a quote? I told her gently. I'm not a replica. Not a legacy. I'm just someone who outlived a silence she didn't choose. That night, I wrote one line in my journal. If I can't understand my father, at least I don't have to become him. Can a person be good and still do harm? Can silence ever mean love? We don't talk enough about the fathers who die unfinished. Chapters unwritten, truths unspoken. This isn't just a true infidelity story. This is what happens when someone cheats not with another lover, but with time, with presence, with the daughter who kept waiting on the other end of a mailbox he never opened. And still, I'm here, writing, not to justify him, not to praise him, but to name the H he left in the walls he built too high to climb. There are some things a father never says to his daughter. Not because he doesn't feel them, but because he never learned the language to speak them. Sometimes those words survive him, buried in voice recordings, yellowing documents, or dusty keys. When truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock. It plays through a speaker and rewrites everything you thought you knew about love, about regret, and about what family revenge stories really look like. The office smelled like old paper and older secrets. I sat across from Mr. Harland, the family attorney, his tie crooked like he knew this was going to hurt someone. "There's something your father left for you, Evelyn," he said, then pressed play. The speaker crackled. And then came the voice. That voice. Rough, deliberate, unmistakably his. Thomas Hart. Still commanding even from the other side of the grave. "If you're hearing this, Evie, then it means I'm no longer here to interrupt you." My breath caught. Not because he was gone, but because he'd never called me Evie after I turned 12. "You are the one thing I could never say out loud without trembling. I was proud of you, Evelyn. Proud in the quiet, in the way fathers from my generation confuse silence with strength." Graham stood, fists clenched. "This is ridiculous," he spat, knocking over his chair as he stormed out. That was the moment I realized human revenge doesn't always look like vengeance. Sometimes it looks like truth finally reaching the right ears. The recording continued. "If Graham cannot learn to listen, then teach him by being silent. He won't like it. That's how you know it's working. I leave Heartland Realty in your care. For 12 months, you lead. After that, decide who we become?" I stared at Mr. Harland. "You're saying I'm the executor?" He nodded. "And the primary heir to the Heartland estate, including the house." Marcia, from across the table, whispered with the kind of cold that cuts from the inside. "You don't understand your father. Don't hurt yourself trying." But I did. Maybe not the version of him that built skylines and signed deals, but the one who scribbled on church sketches and read poems under midnight light. The unfinished man who never dared say what he meant. That afternoon, they handed me a key. Not to the house. To the executive suite at Heartland Tower. A room no one had entered since the morning he collapsed. I went alone. The air was thick with untouched grief and furniture that still held his shape. I sat at his desk, ran my fingers along the grain, and listened. It wasn't noise I heard. It was everything he didn't say echoing off the walls. The things that fathers never say to daughters who refuse to shrink. There, in that stillness, I wrote "The Wall That Speaks." A poem in his office, but not for him. For me. For every daughter who was silenced then made the silence sing. As I walked out, an older man named Alton, the head of security since before I was born, nodded toward me. "Maybe you're not who they expected," he said. "But you're who the company needs." Later that night, I sat on the porch of the house I now owned and whispered to the wind, "I will not be Thomas Hart's echo. I will be the architect of what rises from his ashes." Have you ever inherited something you didn't want, only to realize it was the key to becoming who you were meant to be all along? This isn't just a story about infidelity, or the cheating of time and truth. It's a story of redemption built from dust, of a woman rewriting the ending to a man's unfinished life. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most sacred kind of family drama there is. You don't walk into a boardroom full of wolves and announce you're a poet without drawing blood. They expect steel, spreadsheets, someone whose blood in mergers, not metaphors. But grief makes strange warriors, and sometimes the sharpest leader isn't the one who builds the tallest tower, but the one who walks into the ruins and says, "I'll stay until this place remembers how to breathe again." That's where my revenge began. The first time I entered the Heartland boardroom as CEO, I felt like I'd broken into a museum where nothing belonged to me, except the dust. 12 men, 3 women. 0 smiles. They looked at me the way someone looks at a burning library, unsure if they should mourn the loss or blame the match. One man with a gray mustache didn't wait long. "Miss Hart, have you ever read a balance sheet?" I wanted to say yes, lie and keep the illusion. But I didn't come here to act like my father. I came to undo him. So I answered with truth. "No," I said. "I've never read the language of money, but I know the weight of loss better than most." The room tensed. A few scribbled notes. Most rolled their eyes. I kept going. "We'll be bringing in an independent audit. 5 years of records. No exceptions." I could feel the air change, tension mixed with offense. But I wasn't done. "Effective immediately, all projects without verified funding will be paused." I'm not here to pour concrete over corruption. I'm here to dig. That night, someone leaked my appointment to the Savannah Tribune. Front page. The accidental executive. I taped the article to the back of my bedroom door. Not out of pride, but because sometimes, accidents are the only honest thing that ever happens in a family built on performance. Graham didn't speak to me that week, but But I heard from 3 different board members that he'd started calling closed-door meetings. Burning revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes, it's paper trails. I brought in a team from Atlanta, young, sharp, and not afraid of my last name. Architects who believed in parks over parking lots. Analysts who understood that numbers can lie when no one questions them. That's when the first internal memo surfaced. Flagged years ago for structural risks. Was fast-tracked anyway. Greenlit under executive override. Signed by my father. A betrayal that wore the Hart name like armor. I paused the project. No discussion, no apology. When asked why, I wrote one sentence on the boardroom whiteboard the next morning. I didn't come to build a kingdom. I came to heal what no one thought to ask about. A janitor named Alton caught me leaving the meeting. He'd been with the company longer than most had been alive. He touched the brim of his cap and said, "Maybe you're not what they expected, but you might be what this place needs." And I wondered then, can healing be an act of revenge too? Can rewriting a broken family tale be louder than legacy? This isn't just about cement and signatures. It's about what happens when the daughter they tried to erase learns how to write her name across the ruins. Revenge doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it signs contracts in her own handwriting and leaves the door open for truth to walk through. Some rooms aren't built for you, but you enter them anyway. Head high, voice steady, heart racing just enough to know you're alive. I wasn't the heir they expected. I was the footnote in a family tale rewritten out of anger. But when your life has been underestimated for too long, the only logical response is to lead with truth. Even if all you've ever held are poems instead of power. I stood at the front of the auditorium. Once used for investor pitches, now rebranded for reckoning. Let's be clear, I began. I wasn't anyone's first choice. But I am the one standing here. The entire company had gathered. Some leaned back with crossed arms. Others scanned their phones, pretending to be elsewhere. I felt them questioning me the way one might question a mismatched screw on a collapsing bridge. But I didn't flinch. "I won't ask you to believe in me today," I continued. "Just believe that I came here to learn how to do this right." That afternoon, the advisory team slid a report across my desk. Debt. Big, unseen. Especially tied to the Riverfront East development, an architectural jewel with cracks beneath its gleaming surface. "Your father borrowed deep," they warned. "And someone was covering it up." That someone had a name: Don McAllister. And Don had already passed our internal financial reports to Grom. Revenge stories aren't always loud. Sometimes they're typed, sometimes secret. The media didn't wait long. An article in RealCap Weekly called me the poetry professor turned CEO. I could have laughed. I could have cried. Instead, I hosted a session with the entire staff. No PowerPoint, no numbers, just a whiteboard, a circle of chairs, and my voice. "We don't build to flip," I said. "We build because someone out there needs to call something home. If you don't understand that, you shouldn't be building at all." Some rolled their eyes. But a few nodded, and Nina Caldwell, my father's former operations manager, long retired, showed up the next morning with a fresh notebook in hand. "I heard you were back," she said. "And different. I want to see what that looks like." Meanwhile, Graham sent legal notice. He called it a restructuring proposal. It smelled like cheating stories dressed in strategy. A pitch to sell Heartland off in pieces. A quiet mutiny in the language of business. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I wrote 32 handwritten letters, one to every shareholder. Not typed, not strategic, honest. I told them what I planned, not to rescue profit but to resurrect purpose. And I ended each letter the same way. "If this company ever stood for anything real, let it be this shelter with dignity." A few replied. One even called. "You may not be your father," they said. "And maybe that's the point." That night, I taped a new poem above my desk. "If they call me a dreamer, let me dream wide-eyed. Let me architect mercy into brick and blueprints." The next morning, I reactivated an old project my father shelved. Affordable housing on the South Side. Low returns. High resistance. But necessary. One of the interns asked me why. I smiled. Because hidden revenge isn't about payback. It's about proving that you can do good in the exact place they said you didn't belong. Can you rebuild a legacy not with ambition, but with honesty? And if you can, would they still call you weak? The hardest thing about legacy isn't carrying it. It's deciding what parts are worth keeping. When I inherited Heartland, I thought the real weight would be profit margins and concrete. But what buried me wasn't steel. It was silence. The kind of silence that hides betrayal stories behind polished wood desks and calls it honor. Some darkness lives in ledgers, not closets. And sometimes, the bravest thing a daughter can do is read every line. They told me not to look too close. Let your father rest, one board member whispered. But what they really meant was, let the myth live. Instead, I went digging. It started with a stack of archival financials, buried in the records room behind outdated blueprints and a locked cabinet. That's where I found it. The Heart Charitable Fund, supposedly dormant since 2014. But the transactions told another story. One payment stood out, transferred to a limited LLC co., managed by none other than Graham. Purpose listed, Community Development Research. Reality a yacht-sized lie docked in Betrayal. I sat alone in the boardroom that night, documents spread like a battlefield. I didn't cry, I just felt still. Still in that this changes everything way. By dawn, I called an emergency meeting. When the board shuffled in, coffee in hand and caution in their eyes, I stood without a slide deck. I'm requesting a full forensic audit, I said, not because I don't trust the past, but because I know exactly how well it can lie. Graham's chair scraped back. He rose, red-faced and bitter. You're digging up our father's grave. No, I said calmly. He dug it himself. I'm just measuring how deep the fall went. The room froze. That was the first time I saw fear shift into respect. Not from everyone, but enough. The media caught wind fast. Savannah Journal asked on the front page, is Heartland a legacy or a liability? When I was invited for a television interview, they expected spreadsheets. I gave them a poem. My father built towers. I learned how to stand alone inside them. Now I ask, can a daughter raise truth from a foundation poured in secrets? Public opinion split like Georgia weather. Part storm, part sunshine. Some called me a reformer. Others a traitor. A small protest gathered outside Heartland HQ the next week. Signs read, Heartland isn't a poetry class, and don't destroy what your father built. I didn't hide. I stepped outside, no security, no microphone. Just me. I walked the line, looked into their eyes and asked, what's more dangerous? Truth that hurts or silence that rots? Some turned away. One man lowered his sign, said nothing, just nodded. Later, I wrote in my journal, my father built walls. I'm opening windows. Because sometimes a true infidelity story isn't about love lost between lovers. It's about a legacy cheating its people. About power betraying purpose. And I've decided, the only myth I want to protect is the one I'm rewriting. Can legacy survive if it's stripped down to its bones? And if it can't, was it ever legacy to begin with? Sometimes the ghost you feared had left for good returns with a business card and a suit. Not to haunt you. To replace you. They smile in the lobby, shake hands in the elevator, and call it strategy. But what if betrayal doesn't come from strangers? What if it's blood, dressed up in ambition? And what if the only way to survive isn't to fight harder, but to tell the truth louder? The envelope came on a Tuesday. Plain heavy. Too neat to be good news. Inside, a motion from shareholders, initiated by Graham, calling for a no confidence vote, no greetings, no surprise. Only a signature I knew by heart, and the sting of family knives hidden behind boardroom protocol. Graham was back, not as a sibling. As opposition. He didn't need the CEO title, he had influence. And influence speaks fluent betrayal. That night I found a second letter waiting at my front gate. Willa Dent, my father's former assistant, a woman who once looked at me like I was an echo instead of a name. Inside her envelope documents, transaction ledgers, email printouts. At the center of them all Kings Bay. The ghost project my father swore was dead on paper. Turns out it was only hiding, sick with financial rot. And Graham had signed every one of its disguises. Willa said softly. But you're brave. And that's different. So we worked. Me and Willa. Night after night. 47 pages. One report. It read like a cheating wife story, if the wife was the company and the affair was with silence. Meanwhile, Graham waged war with soundbites, video campaigns, buzzwords like emotional instability and legacy disruption. He said I used grief like a ladder, that I'd written poems on my father's tombstone just to sit in his chair. I didn't respond. Instead, I invited Georgia Lang, spoken word artist, fire breather of a woman, to lead a creative workshop with our staff. We're not just rebuilding policies, I told them. We're teaching ourselves how to speak. Then came the vote. A shareholders' meeting disguised as a trial. Graham's side arrived with graphs and consultants. I came with a poem, a worn folder, and my own name. When it was my turn, I opened a small cloth-bound book. I didn't come here to rescue Heartland, I said. I came to rebuild the way we think about leadership. Then I read, no one keeps fire in bloodstained hands. Not for long, I light with truth. Not memory. Not myth. Just the kind of light that refuses to lie. Some shareholders scoffed, some cried. And when the vote was counted, it came down to a breath. I stayed. He walked. But not quietly. As Graham exited, he didn't look back. Not at me. Not at the people he'd tried to control. Just whispered to a reporter. "She's not done with this place." But neither am I. That night I wrote, "The story doesn't end with applause. It ends when the echo stops chasing me." And I wonder, as I sit with the silence that follows, can family heal when the root of betrayal was planted so deep it grew into your own shadow? Sometimes victory feels more like silence than applause. After you win, what's left is the mess. The ghosts, the damage, the people watching to see if you'll fall. But trust isn't something you inherit, you build it. With sweat. With consistency. With a voice that refuses to vanish. And maybe, just maybe, with a poem that says I see you. I stayed. And I still believe in the bones of this place. The morning after the vote, the office smelled like bleach and beginnings. I walked in with a mug that said truth over trend and a folder labeled rebuild. Inside, new hires. Young, hungry, fierce in their belief that finance didn't have to mean fraud. The first to join was a woman named Kiara. 28, raised on the South Side, former CFO at a housing startup. "I don't want a job," she said. "I want a reason." I gave her both. We cleared out the old finance team by lunch. By evening, I sent out a memo that began, "We're not patching leaks. We're changing the pipes." Later that week, I brought in Jude. Not as a friend. As a healer. He stood in front of a room of tired employees and asked, "What does stress feel like in your body?" And then handed out notebooks. "Wie fix right to recover?" Wasn't just a program. It was a mirror. That same night, an email landed in my inbox. Subject line, "Tara, from a different heart." My cousin, who hadn't spoken to me in 12 years, who once said my poetry wasn't for people with jobs. She apologized. Said she'd read about Heartland's shift. Wanted to invest. I didn't say yes. Didn't say no. Just wrote back, "Let's talk about why now matters more than then." I hosted a public workshop, no press, no ribbon cutting. Just folding chairs and floor plans for affordable housing. I showed them the new design. How we could build homes that held dignity, not just people. A high schooler lingered after. "You read a poem in my class once. That's why I'm studying architecture now." It stunned me still. How words planted seeds in soil you never saw. Of course, Graham wasn't silent. He posted a LinkedIn essay titled, "Vision Needs Structure." He didn't name me. But every line carried the weight of implication. I didn't reply. But I wrote a poem anyway. They call me unrealistic, as if hope never built a bridge. As if dreams don't draft blueprints before budgets. Later that week, Willa walked into my office. Closed the door. Sat. "Your father," she said, "was going to step down. Quietly. He told me." I froze. "Then why didn't he?" She looked toward the window. "Graham begged him to stay. Said it would ruin his chances if the heart name stepped back." It hit like breath leaving the lungs. Not an infidelity story of the body, but of belief. Of Graham choosing empire over honesty. That night, I stood at the edge of the river and whispered into the wind. "I won't be the flame that comes from someone else's ashes. I'll burn on my own terms." And I wondered, how many of us carry names we didn't choose but are still expected to defend? They said legacy was something to protect, to preserve like fine china behind glass. But what if legacy was never meant to be inherited, but redesigned? What if your greatest act of loyalty was to break the mold your family handed you, and rebuild it in the name of healing? Not all revenge burns. Some of it builds. Brick by brick, word by word. Hope, after all, can be louder than inheritance. They called it Reckless. A nonprofit arm tied to real estate. Art workshops embedded in zoning codes. Poetry in blueprints. Project Heartline began not as a business model, but as a declaration: we build more than square footage, we build futures. The pitch deck wasn't slick. The numbers weren't sexy, but when I said, profit is the vehicle, people are the destination, some in the room nodded. Some left. One investor stayed behind. He slid his business card across the table. "If you trim the nonprofit parts," he said, "I'll double your budget." I looked him dead in the eye. "If I trim the soul, what's left to build on?" He left too, but the room didn't empty. It clarified. Weeks later, I stepped onto the Tech's Atlanta stage. The lights were warm. My hands didn't shake. My talk, healing the unfinished inheritance. I told them about concrete and ink. About forgiveness dressed like a blueprint. About a father who taught me how to measure property, but never how to measure pain. I read a line from my new book, Concrete Inky. I did not inherit his name. I inherited his wreckage. And I learned how to rebuild. The book sold out. Someone told me later that a man in the back stood alone for the whole event. Didn't speak. Didn't stay for photos. "Graham, Even from a distance, he still knew how to haunt a room. The next morning, a little girl handed me a crayon drawing. A house made of words, her name in the corner. "You build houses with letters," she said. I swallowed a sob. At the next board meeting, the vote was unanimous. No longer interim, no more footnotes. Evelyn Hart, not despite my past, because of how I've faced it. At Heartline's opening ceremony, I wore no suit, just a scarf my mother had sewn. The community showed up in folding chairs and construction boots. Kids sat cross-legged near the front. I didn't cut a ribbon. I read a poem. Where walls once cracked, I leave windows. Where silence lived, I leave questions. Where something fell apart, I plant something new. At the close, I looked at the crowd. Legacy, I said, isn't what we receive. It's how we return it better than we found it. And I wonder, when we stop trying to fix our parents' stories and start writing our own, does that count as betrayal, or the bravest kind of love? Some doors you lock so tightly you forget they ever existed. Then fame nudges them open again, some creak, some shatter. People return with apologies, gossip, or thin hopes of salvage. Yet every knock demands a choice to forgive or to hold the line. Because the real test isn't winning power. It's choosing who gets to walk across your threshold when the lights are brighter and the rooms are quieter. The ping of my phone felt like a ghost stepping into the room. It was Jenna Martinez. A voice from senior year who once mock read my poem in front of the class. Now her message shook my screen. "I'll phone, sorry. Been reading your poetry nightly. Didn't know I needed it." My pulse stuttered. 10 years. One text. Another ping from Ashley Reed, a reporter who once wrote me off in print. She wants me on the Leadership in Wounds podcast. The world was leaning in. Doors I thought locked tight were swinging open. Then there was Marcia. She arrived at the office carrying a photo album. No words. Just silent footsteps through memories of me as a child. Twirling in a too-big dress, ribbons in my hair. I watched her set it beside my desk. An olive branch draped in silence. That evening, a letter arrived, from a college student I don't know, thanking me. "Your text talk made me believe a shy girl like me could lead." I taped it to my mirror. Jude called. "I'm thinking let the city speak. Outdoors, community, poetry as hearing voices." The proposal slipped under my door, I didn't hesitate. Then came Tara's email. My once bitter cousin, now reaching across ghosts. She asked to meet. To reread letters I sent her that she never answered. Her words bore water in their apology. When we sat across from each other, I unfolded each letter and we cried over missed pages and missing years. Meanwhile, Graham reappeared. Not in person, but in an email. "I may have been wrong. You're worthy." I pinned it inside my notebook of letters unsent. No reply. No reunion. A documentary crew contacted us. American Legacy, Stories of Reinvention. They called Evelyn Hart a symbol. I signed the release. That night I wrote in my journal, "I don't trust those who return because I left. But I respect those who stay when I no longer shine." And I realized this wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about choosing who crosses your threshold, who gets to see the rooms you've rebuilt. Sometimes, the loudest love lives in silence, in houses left untouched, in boxes sealed tight. We grow up believing we were unloved, only to find our names folded inside a letter never sent. So, what happens when the truth you longed for arrives too late to be heard, but not too late to be felt? She stood in the doorway of the old house, where the air still carried the scent of cedar, mildew, and history. It was the first time Evelyn had stepped back in since the funeral, not as a daughter grieving, but as a woman looking for truth. Dust gathered on the hardwood floors like unread poems. She rolled up her sleeves. In the basement, behind rusted paint cans and forgotten trophies, she found a small wooden box. No name, no key, just weight and quiet. Inside letters, dozens. All addressed to her, all unsent. She read them on the floor, knees pulled to her chest like she used to as a girl hiding from the storm. One letter stopped her breath. Dated the day she left for New York. "If the walls I built seemed too cold, maybe they were just armor for the fear of losing you." She didn't cry because he said sorry. She cried because he once wanted to. Later, she opened what would become the still room. She hung sketches of his from forgotten drawers, pinned up her own torn poems, laid his letters beside hers. An exhibition of what was written and what wasn't. The old typewriter he used sat at the center, polished now, with a note she placed. "Even unsaid words echo if you let them." Neighbors began to visit. One whispered, "He used to stand by the window at night when you visited, but never came outside." Graham showed up one afternoon. He didn't knock. He walked through the hall slowly, hands brushing the banister like it might disappear. Stopped at a letter pinned to the wall. "Read it. Dad wrote this." he asked, barely audible. Evelyn only nodded. Graham didn't apologize, didn't defend. He just said, I didn't know. And maybe that was the truest thing he'd said in years. That night, Evelyn wrote, "This house doesn't answer back, but I still leave the door open. Sometimes, we don't get closure. Sometimes all we get is clarity. Some conversations are not meant to end in applause or tears, not meant to be performed or recorded. They are meant to exhale the weight of decades, to let one sentence crack a silence that has lived too long. Sometimes, we don't need to forgive or be forgiven. We just need to be witnessed, quietly, fully, one last time." And what if healing didn't sound like closure, but like finally not needing it? I mailed him the poem, folded twice, no note, just my words, bleeding across the page, let the wind pass through the blood. It was the only way I knew how to begin. 2 days later, Graham called. His voice wasn't angry, wasn't trying to be big. "Maybe it's time we talk," he said. No blame. No press. We met at Forsyth Park. The old swing set gone, but the bench under the pecan tree remained. The one we used to argue over, who'd get to sit on the armrest. Now we couldn't even meet each other's eyes. At first, we just sat, birdsong above us, tension between us. I thought of all the things I could say, none of them better than silence. Finally, Graham spoke. He told me about the first time our father hit him, over a misfiled contract when he was barely 21. I remember thinking, he said, maybe this means he sees me as a man. His voice cracked. And later realizing, maybe he didn't know how else to speak power. I said nothing for a while. Then quietly, I lost him too. Not to fists but to distance. He stopped listening the moment I chose poetry over real estate. He nodded. I hated that he trusted you more without needing you to be him. I spent years trying to be Thomas Hart. You just didn't need to? My throat clenched. But I didn't flinch. I never wanted his trust, I said. I just wanted to stop being invisible. He looked at me, older than I remembered, and said, I know you don't want an apology. I don't, I said. I want us to stop breaking each other to protect a man who's already gone. There were no hugs. No promises. We stood up at the same time, nodded. As we turned away, I whispered, not for him but for me. We don't need to reconcile. We need to release. Later that night, my assistant handed me an envelope. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges. On the first page for Eve, if you're still writing, it was his. My father's. The same one he carried everywhere but never let me touch. I pressed it to my chest, felt nothing theatrical, just steady. In my journal, I wrote, sometimes the most radical act of love is to sit down and say, tell me your version, and I won't correct it. They say a single spark can ignite a forest. But what happens when that spark must burn not in isolation, but within a city built on old wounds, cheap concrete, and even cheaper promises? They invited me to the council with praise, then measured me by spreadsheets. So here I stand, grappling with sleepless nights and sudden betrayals, trying to keep the spark alive, not just for me, but for every hidden ember waiting to glow. I still feel the weight of that invitation. Mayor Corwin said it straight. We need your voice on the Sustainability Council. My pulse raced. I'd written lines in dim rooms, not cities. But the offer came, so I said yes quietly, bravely. Then came the backlash. Real estate tycoons scoffed, calling me poet-turned-planner, an idealist who will do real harm. The kind of whispers, she doesn't speak the language we built this city with. And with each brick they threw with words, my nights grew longer, full of restless heat. 3 a.m. became my confession time. I'd scribble verses by bedside lamp, writing therapy into the thin paper, like healing in slow mo. I wrote lines about walls breathing and streets remembering. I wrote lines about hearts in public trust. Then came the worst blow. An investor pulled funding after my council speech. I had spoken of community over capital, art over profit, and they branded me too emotional to run a company. The room went still as paper. My board members looked at me like I'd proposed a revolution. Jude found me the next morning, cupping my cheek, whispering, you can't keep that fire burning alone, Evelyn. Sometimes stepping away, that's how it blazes brighter. My eyes stung, but I nodded. I called the communications team. No fighting online. We speak with projects. We show action. Silence would be our answer, until papers of change spoke louder than tweets. Days later, letters began arriving. First, internships. Teenagers wanting to help paint murals and renovate houses. We call you the poet who builds homes, one wrote. I pressed it to my chest, thinking of why I started all this. Then a letter from Wyoming. We're blending poetry with farming. You lit the way. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about the flame I'd lit, not as a community hearth. So I founded Urban Poets, gathering architects, planners, writers, city dreamers. Our first meeting, a few strangers around a folding table. By the end, voices were trembling with hope, architecture sketches had doodled notes. Walls that speak. I closed the week with a workshop I led, poetry to repair public trust. Eyes wet, pens shaking, hands clutched each other like lifelines. What would you build if you let your heart shape the skyline, and let others carry the flame with you? I've learned a fire held in secret dies, but a fire seen, shared, protected by others. That fire writes its own legacy across city blocks and human souls. I sent an open letter to Savannah, asking for a single line that whispered hope. I never imagined 700 voices, from school children and loners, construction workers and poets, would pour in. What began as a spark in my notebook turned into a chorus echoing across brick and mortar. These are the nameless lights of a city I once fled, now glowing in every heartbeat of its rebuilt streets. I remember sealing that letter like a prayer, on paper and in ink. You have one line? I wrote. Then I waited. What came back shattered me over 700 pieces of human fire, each unique. The youngest, a 7-year-old boy, said, "Home is where my mother smiles again." That line, pure as morning, became our first light. We chose the 100 strongest glimmers. My team and I walked walls in the newest Heartland homes, silent. But with that verse etched across bricks, I felt ghosts smile. I thought of us together, glowing. Jude took charge of the spoken word launch, residents reading their own lines under floodlights. I stood at the back, breath stuck, watching strangers, our neighbors, claim their words. When I saw Graham slip in, uncanny quiet, he pressed a candle beneath one of my verses. No fanfare? No words? Just light? At that moment, I realized light doesn't demand a name to matter. Then the press came. Real estate built by language. That title, a twist I never saw coming, felt weight on my chest and wings under my skin. Atlantic magazine nominated me as Citizen of the Year. I felt the sting of doubt, again. But I stood at the podium and read, light lines that need no name still light up a city at night. A few days later, Heartland announced 20% of profits reinvested into community art. That choice might be more revolutionary than any deal I've signed. If your words were carved into walls, what hope would you hang for strangers to find? This project taught me that legacy isn't about whose name's on the paperwork. It's about whose light reflects off those walls in the dark. There's a silence that wraps around betrayal long after the shouting stopped. It lives in boardrooms and bedrooms, in the corners of family portraits and empty chairs at the table. When I was asked to sign the papers that could end my brother's career, the only sound I heard was my own breath. Slow, steady, whispering, some justice looks like prison, and some looks like a man rebuilding with his bare hands. The report landed on my desk like a gavel. Thick, cold, final. Pages of mismanagement, manipulation, money funneled through ghost accounts, all tracing back to my brother, Graham. Some shareholders wanted blood. Burn the name off the door. One of them said, let her bury the ghost for good. But I didn't come here to bury anyone. I came to rebuild. I visited him. He was hammering drywall in a halfway shelter for veterans. No suit, no headlines, no sharp tongue, just hands calloused. Quieter than I remembered. I can't give back what I took, he said, eyes low, but I can build something else. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to remind him of the years he gaslit me, the deals he closed behind closed doors, the cheating stories I'd buried in journals labeled fiction. But instead, I listened. Later, I called a closed-door meeting. I spoke of restorative justice, of repairing, not erasing. I asked the board to let Graham lead a public project. 18 months, no paycheck, no power, just work. Some called it weakness. But 6 out of 9 said yes. We announced his new role, community coordinator at Lightlines. It was the first time in years his name was spoken in public without venom. I didn't forgive because he earned it. I forgave because I refused to let my future wear the chains of his past. There's a new park in the center of Savannah now. On its stone wall, etched above a garden of low-light blooms, is one of my lines. El ilam ka kuno yankan and I'm dingieta yin lotaiba gute tran. Some mistakes are not walls. If you dare rebuild with bare hands. When someone you once loved asks for a second chance. Not with words, but with work. How do you know when to offer the brick instead of the blade? I stood at the pinnacle of success. The numbers were soaring, press calling me the face of humanity and leadership. Yet my chest felt hollow, as if applause had replaced my heartbeat. I turned down a TV deal, closed my eyes, and realized, I wasn't Evelyn Hart the poet, I was Evelyn Hart CEO. But who am I beneath the boardroom glow? I needed to stop performing and start listening. to the words I once wrote for no audience but myself. The quarterly report buzzed through the room: record profits, skyrocketing stock value, headlines praising my vision. But the glow felt distant, like a spotlight without a stage. I caught Jude's gaze, steady and knowing. He murmured after the meeting. Not the woman we know. He was right. That night I picked up a pen, my old ritual. My words stumbled, blanks filled with silence. Lines like bone silence is the pulse I forgot. The next morning I disappeared from the public eye. No speeches, no interviews. Instead, I enrolled in a creative writing course at a local college, anonymous. Just on my assignment sheets. In that classroom I met real voices, a student who said, "You don't write like someone successful. You write like someone who's lost." I felt it, my own words echoing their truth. My identity had been swallowed by my job. Weeks passed. I attended an open mic night, heart pounding. I waited among strangers, poems folded in my pocket. When my turn came, I whispered my words soft, raw. If applause is stealing your breath, step back and remember your own beating heart. There was no camera, no flash, just a circle of eyes. My voice trembled but connected. Applause came, gentle, warm, but I sensed it wasn't for a boardroom triumph. It was for me. When I left that night, I walked under a sky full of stars, quiet stars that didn't need witnesses. I realized, owning my power didn't mean losing my essence. If you found yourself stripped of titles and praise, would you still recognize the person in the mirror? From the front pages to the boardrooms, I've been celebrated as the accidental savior of Heartland. Yet behind that applause, a quiet question weighed on me: what remains when I'm gone? So, I announced I'd step down in a year. Not to escape, but to ensure Heartland didn't survive on me, but for me. The real inheritance isn't wealth. It's the belief you spark in others, not the empire you leave behind. I remember the moment I made the announcement, my voice steady, heart pounding. The room froze. "I'm not selling Heartland," I said, watching ears lean in. "I'm preparing to hand it over." The silence that followed carried the weight of expectation and uncertainty. Whispers floated. Is she stepping down because we failed? I knew their fear. I, too, had felt it. But this wasn't goodbye, it was an invitation. Over the next weeks, not based on MBA credentials, but on humanity and vision, they spoke of value before performance. One in particular struck me: Lee McCarthy, 42, once led a resettlement nonprofit for migrants. She carried empathy in her resume. I set up a 6-month mentorship under Heartland's roofs, former leaders hand in hand with rising voices. We shared cultures, not KPIs. We shared errors, not only successes. We shared stories. Then came the Heartland Institute launch, a place for creative leadership, community, and poetry applied to urban rebirth. I was center stage as founder, but not for me. My final act as CEO was to light this torch. Graham, my brother, stood beside me. This time as first guest lecturer. He spoke softly but with power. What happens when you build wrong and choose to stay and make right? His voice trembled, not from pain, but from hope. A little girl caught my eye afterward. She handed me a picture, crayons and paper, vibrant yet simple. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're the one who puts commas between homes and hearts." My breath halted, my vision tunneled. Suddenly, every fight, every doubt, every poem had led to this. Jude, my creative twin, curated an exhibition, People Who Don't Need Statues, because their light is enough to be seen. Photos of community gardens, open mic nights, shared meals, and laughter bloomed on gallery walls. Each image, each face, each story testament. At the Institute's first ceremony, I spoke from a place deeper than grief or pride. "Legacy isn't the name etched on buildings," I said, voice soft, "it's where you place trust." And as I looked at Leah, poised to step forward, I realized that my greatest work wasn't launching projects. It was igniting belief in others. Can belief be as strong as blood? Can it be the inheritance we pass on? I stepped back that night, allowing Lee to speak next. I'd seeded more than change. I'd planted roots in others' soil. And in that moment, leaving wasn't losing. It was allowing growth. When letters from the dust hit bookshelves, I didn't expect tears from strangers, confessions shared across borders, or an old man in Kansas writing to the daughter he lost 2 decades ago. I thought it was my story, but what poured and turned our story, the story of unspoken love, of wounds hidden in silence. And suddenly, a manuscript became a movement. I poured my heart into letters from the dust, unsent letters, poems cut like memories, diary entries pregnant with longing. I held my breath as it soared to the non-fiction bestseller list, and realized it was never about fame. Each chapter, a letter to my father, to Graham, to myself, carried a title meant to break bones and heal hearts. A letter to the father who never said "I love you." Then, the world replied. Letters arrived, hundreds of them, from children abandoned, spouses betrayed, souls seeking truth. One came from an 82-year-old man in Kansas. For the first time in 20 years, I wrote to my daughter who passed away. Another from a prison warden, asking for permission to teach detainees how to write their own letters to the unasked. Jude and I launched the Dust Archive, a community space. Paper, pens, silence, and healing. People poured in, voices that had never been heard stood up. Their letters wove a tapestry of shared human struggle. One of my own lines, printed on postcards, scattered in libraries, pinned to fridges, echoed everywhere. If you have stayed silent too long, the first letter doesn't need to be perfect. It became our mantra. In the final pages of my book, I confessed, I forgive not to reclaim my father, but to ensure I don't become him. When Graham's letter was published, a quiet announcement in a newspaper, I read, "Thank you for telling your side. I'm learning to tell mine." And in that moment, I recognized that healing wasn't linear. Then came the biggest surprise. Letters from the Dust became core reading in ethics and memory courses across universities. Words typed in bedrooms, once hidden in pain, now taught under fluorescent lights. Can the letters we never send become the stories that redefine us? I sit now with the manuscripts, the postcards, the letters still arriving. It's no longer my voice alone. It's a choir of the unasked, unblinded, unforgotten. And as the archive grows, I realize impact isn't in what you write, but what you inspire others to write. I traded Savannah's boardrooms and bright lights for the hush of Maine's coastline, thinking I was stepping away, only to realize stories never truly leave us. They linger in the creak of a wooden floor, the salt on the window pane. And as I settle at a small desk facing the bay, I know this is where the real legacy begins. Not in what I start, but in what I leave behind, softly echoing. I arrived in that secluded seaside town, my heart heavy yet relieved. I moved into a humble wooden cottage, just a desk, a shelf of worn books, and a single window opening to the ever-changing sea. Solitude felt less like loneliness and more like a sanctuary. Then Jude showed up, carrying the Heartland photo album. He placed it gently on the table. "Here are all the places you reignited light," he said. I let him see my tears. A letter arrived early next morning, from Leah, the one I'd carefully mentored. Inside, a poem. "You didn't leave an office. You left footsteps, letting us learn how to walk ourselves." My pulse quickened. That moment, it felt like handing over a candle and watching flames spread. Not long after, I got news from a high school art class. Their assignment, "Who inspires you most?" had placed my name in the top 3. I almost laughed at the irony. Me, the accidental CEO turned unseen muse. In my mind I write, I once thought legacy was a company. Now, legacy is the language you leave others to name themselves. Another letter, this one from Graham, arrived in my mailbox. He ended with grace I didn't expect. "You were the first in our family to really listen, even when no words came back." My breath caught. This was the forgiveness I'd always cradled, unknowing. Jude launched Letters After Evelyn, an online gathering. Folks read the letters they'd never dared to send. Confessions to parents, apologies to lost loved ones, dreams unspoken. Their voices, a reminder that healing happens in shared breaths. A young mentee wrote from Portland, "If she rebuilt herself from ravaged ruins, I can too." I saved it. Late afternoon, I sit at that desk by the window, pen in hand, finishing the last lines in my journal. If someone finds me, tell them, read again the places I once wrote. A subtle viewer question inserted, do we ever truly step away from stories, or do they carry on through those we touch, shaping futures we can only begin to imagine? In that soft, golden dusk, I understand the story doesn't end because the light travels on. I'm no longer the central voice, but just one note in the hushed song of countless lives rewritten. So I turn page by page, letter by letter, allowing silence and hope to do the rest.